Hey, this is Jeff from MidStreet, and this is video 4 in the Small Business Valuation Essentials training series. This is the video on picking the weighted average SDE or EBITDA for your business. So, say you're valuing a business and the earnings last year, 2021, were $1 million. The year before that, in 2020, they were $250,000, and the year before that, 2019, they were $550,000. What SDE number would you use when you were applying it to your multiple? So would you use $1 million, $750,000? Could you take a straight average of the 3 years, or would you use some type of weighted average? And do you take into account projections? The seller might think the next year is going to be even better. So that's what we're going to talk about in this video. So what are the options available to us? So I'm going to go through these 6, and then on the next slide highlights which ones are actually good to use and which ones aren't. So I'll let you pick based on what's listed here. So number 1, using only the most recent year. Number 2, taking a weighted and unweighted average. So that's just a straight average, adding them all up and then dividing by the number. Taking a weighted average of the last couple years. Taking a weighted average and including a projection for the rest of this year. Or taking a weighted average and including a projection for next year. And then 6, using projections entirely without using historical financials. So take a guess which ones you think are good, and boom. Okay, so using only the most recent year is usually not a good idea. Taking an unweighted average of the last couple years is usually not a good idea either, and it's actually in the USPAP standards and the IRS revenue rulings that's not the right strategy. Taking a weighted average of the last couple years is an okay strategy. Taking a weighted average of the last couple years and projecting out the rest of this year. So say it's June and you have the January through June financials, then you would estimate what the rest of the year is going to be and then average that full year into the last couple years, or taking a weighted average of the last couple years and using a projection for the next year. Those are all good strategies, but using projections entirely is usually not a very good strategy, at least within small business. So sometimes in public markets, that's the right strategy, but for the purposes of 1 to 50 million, it's usually not the right way to go. So this gives you an idea of how this would look in an Excel model, just so that you can understand what is meant by a weighted average. So for instance, 2019 would be 3 years ago, 2020 would be 2 years ago, 2021 is the last full calendar year or fiscal year of financials, and then 2020 would be the year that we're in. So when it says partial year, what's meant by that is we have some of the data, and then we estimated what the full year was. So the business we estimated did 2.9 million or will do for this full year. For instance, it's August right now. We might have financials through July, and then I'm going to guess as to what the full year will look like. And then the forecast is, as it sounds, it's us guessing what 2023 will be when we're in 2022. And then you can see here the revenue, COGS, gross profit, total expenses, and then the SDE, and then the weighting. So what the weighting does is, say that you were going to figure out what the weighted average is. You would multiply the SDE times the weight for that year, then add it to the SDE times the weight for the next year, and so on. So as long as the weights sum up to 100%, you'll be fine and you'll get that weighted average number. So now we're going to jump into some example cases of different earnings performance for businesses, whether it's increasing, decreasing, fluctuating, and talk about some of what I would do. I will tell you the next couple slides are a little bit of opinion, and they also are a little bit dependent on the business that you're valuing. There's a lot of qualitative factors that you have to take into account. So I wouldn't just necessarily apply the rules that we talk about in the next couple slides, but you need to think about the particulars of the business you're valuing. So let's jump in. Okay, so the easiest case to value is obviously stable earnings. If the business makes roughly the same amount every year, then you can just take a weighted average of the last 3 years and use that. So you're going to want, if it's increasing at all, to take a weighted average, or just look at whatever the last couple years are and pick a round number that's around there. So for this business, I might pick 1.46 as the earnings number to use with the comps. The next case is the best case, constantly or consistently improving earnings. As a broker, this is what we like to see. As a business owner, this is what you like to see, what buyers like to see, and that's the years improving at a reasonable rate. So what I would do is typically take a weighted average of the last 3 years here, with most of the weight being on 2021. If we have good partial year numbers, so numbers between, I would say anything later than June, then you're going to want to start to include a partial year and give it some significant weight, because the business is already proving that it continue that growth trajectory. So for instance, if I did this exact situation that you see on the screen in January, then I probably wouldn't use a partial year. And the weighted average I came up with would be somewhere around this 2021 number, maybe a little bit lower between these two. If it was September and the business had already done 1.6 million or 1.5 million through September, then the weighted average that I took would include that partial year estimate, and it would be somewhere between the 2021 and the 2022 partial year. Cool. All right. The worst case that you can have is 3 years of declining earnings, and then even worse, I guess, is 3 years of declining earnings and a year-to-date comparison P&L that shows that this year is down over or down under last year. So in this case, I would take a weighted average of the last 2 years. I would typically exclude that third year back, 2019 here, because it's already almost, it's 40% different. So you're starting to see a pretty significant decline here. And so I'd use the most recent 2 years, take a weighted average of those. Again, if you were already past, say, June, I would start to look at the most recent year and say, are we up or down? If you're down in the partial year, then your weighted average is probably going to be somewhere between 2021 and the 2022 partial year. One of the harder cases is earnings that fluctuate significantly. So if you have, in this case, 1.4, then 500, then 1.2, that's a pretty significant fluctuation, and you're going to have trouble. In this case, I would start to dig into more of the qualitative factors and figure out what's driving the change. I will say in the past 2 years, there's been a focus on COVID and how COVID's affected business financials. I'll make a video on valuing businesses during COVID, probably after this course, to address the topic in more detail. But the general answer that I give is you can discount that year significantly. So in this case, you see the business did 1.45 in SDE, then 576, then 1.23. My argument to a buyer or a seller and to substantiate the valuation would be that COVID year was obviously hampered significantly, and then it started to improve in 2021. So I would then look at mostly 21 and the partial. I would put very little to no weight on these 2 years. I think it's fair to exclude this year, and then it's also fair if you exclude this year, I feel like by necessity you have to exclude the years before and just start to look at how's the business doing post-COVID. It's a very different landscape, so I would prefer to focus on that if it is COVID driven. If it's not, and say 2021 or 2022 was the year that was down, then I would focus primarily on spreading out that weight and figuring out what's the story there. So talk to the business owner, look at the bigger macroeconomic factors and say what's driving that year to be so bad. It really comes down to, in this case, a lot of research into the business and a lot of digging to understand what drove that decrease. So, and then another hard case is crazy growth. When you're seeing growth of greater than 50% a year, it's really difficult to value. And what you're going to want to do is similarly take the time to dig into what's causing the growth. Were they awarded 1 or 2 big contracts, or is it a recurring revenue, growth in like subscribers or customers at a landscaping business, or something that's a little bit more organic, and put that into how you choose to weight the financials. So say that this was a landscaping company and they were doing a lot of pay-per-click, they had got a new website, they had wrapped their trucks, and they were starting to see the results of that. And say in this case that the partial year showed that they were also up 25% over the most recent year. I would really start to look at weighting this maybe 5 and then 10% and then 40% and then start to weight into the future a little bit as well. But if this was a business like a construction business and they had been awarded a big contract in 2021, then I would start to ask, well, what is, do you have any future contracts that you know of? Have you bid on anything? Is there anything that you're expecting to come in? And just flesh it out a little bit more before coming up with that weighted average. So in terms of how this would look in a valuation, this is what our Excel model looks like. You can see that in this case, we chose to value primarily the most recent year and then the future. And these numbers are individually multiplied and then added up to sum up down here. And then this is the number that we'll use in future videos when we're talking about comps and how to come up with an accurate number to use for the multiple. This is the number that you'll multiply against that. So hopefully this gave you a good overview of how to weight financials. This is where the art of valuation starts to come in. So if it's a little bit confusing why you choose to weight one thing different than another, over time you'll start to develop a sense for the goal. And the goal is to accurately reflect both the historical financials and the historical performance, but then also take into account what you feel the future is going to be by asking questions and looking at the broader market and then looking at what drove the historical performance for the business. So thanks again for watching. In the next video, we're going to talk about comps. So thanks for watching and look forward to seeing you in that video. Thanks.